After having decided how the teams will be formed and when we have allocated time estimates for every task in our plan, then it's time to project the generic calendar, the generic plan into the real calendar. As soon as we know how many class sessions do we have every week, and the final dates for each of these class sessions. So let's see a few considerations regarding this last issue. There are several issues that we must take into account. For example, let's imagine that between week 3 and 4 we have a vacation period, for example Easter holidays. In this case, we can propose a version 0 with more ambitious requirements. Perhaps move some requirements from version 1 to version 0, assuming that the students will be able to dedicate some extra time to the project during that vacation period. Perhaps in another edition of the course, Easter holidays occurs between week 4 and 5. In this case, perhaps we should modify the requirements of version 0 and those of version 1. This is an example of adjustment that we may have to make. But perhaps the most important adjustment has to do with the number of class sessions each week. In our generic planning, we have assumed that each week have only one class session, but let's imagine that this is not the case and that we actually have 2 class sessions a week of 1 hour 30 minutes each. In this case, we need a 4-column schedule, like this one in the figure. The first column indicates what will happen in the first class session of the week, maybe Monday. The second is what students must do outside the class between the first and the second class sessions. The third one indicates what will happen in the second class session, for instance, on Thursday. And the fourth column, what the students must do before the first session of the following week. Adapting generic planning to this format does not have to be particularly complicated. It is about distributing tasks in a different way. For instance, this could be in the picture, this could be how to do it in week 2, different distribution. But now let's imagine that next year the schedule changes and our 2 weekly class sessions are on Tuesday and Wednesday. In this case, we may have to change the schedule, because we cannot assume that the students will be able to dedicate this time between the first session and the second one. Perhaps in this case the initial generic planning is more appropriate, in which we divide the tasks of in the first column into 2 consecutive class sessions, assuming that the students will not do any homework between these 2 sessions. Or even in the worst case, it may happen that 2 teachers of the same subject have different schedules, and that forces them to follow 2 different plans, even though they are both willing to follow the same plan. For all these reasons, we recommend that whenever possible, there is only 1 long class session per week. In this case, you can always use the generic planning, although in the following year they changed the day of the week in which we have the weekly class session. We know that it is not always easy to make changes in the class schedules, and that in general, academic responsibles do not like very long class sessions. But in the case of project-based learning, we believe that this is the most appropriate scenario. Another thing to do is to locate complementary tasks in the planning. For example, we must decide that the basic knowledge exam must be taken in week 5. And naturally, we must assign some time to that task. But we must also plan some activity in class to prepare for the exam. Maybe some exercises solved by the teacher in class, or a group work activity for students, and also some activities outside the class, such as, for example, performing some exercises similar to those of the exam with a self-assessment report that allows the teacher to identify which students may need help to prepare the exam.